Hello and welcome to A New Nation, the podcast that discusses the ideas that matter. My name is Nathan Sparling and I'm delighted to be joined by my wonderful co-host, Nick Ward.
Hello, my name is Nick Ward. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Nathan, as
It's a
the
pleasure as always.
co-host. People may notice that we do not have any special guests this week. Why are you so happy about that?
I think it's nice having guests. It mixes things up. I'm just glad we're not talking about the US election anymore.
That is true. After 3 election special episodes, I feel like our special guest Ollie had also had enough of talking about the US election.
He was amazing, and if you've not listened to our US election episodes, definitely worth a listen to. You get the full story arc from the start, before we knew anything that happened, right in the middle when we were, there was so much uncertainty, and then at the end, I mean, we still actually don't really know what's happened, but we've concluded our US election special.
We've decided what's happened. What's happened is that Joe Biden has won, and we called it first. Did we call it first?
Well, no, I don't think so. Before we get cracking any further on, it might be worth just stating, as we always do at the start of the podcast, that the views that we express are not those of our employers. Sometimes they're not even our views.
Often not my own views. Like I love taking that sort of devil's advocate position and just being very difficult, as Nathan knows.
Yes, so that's why if you're watching on YouTube, you can see me roll my eyes a lot.
Always, constantly.
But yes, they're sometimes not our views. Often they are, but don't hold them against us. It's all in the name of debate, discussion, and conversation. And we'd love you to join in the conversation too. So please do tweet us at A New Nation Pod, or you can find us on Facebook, or our email address will be in the description below. And today we're going to have a bumper news special. We've not really talked about the news for like 2 weeks.
Nothing's happened. Everything's been chill. What are you on about? What news is there? Everyone's just been sleeping and watching America. That's it.
It's definitely what it felt like I did for 2 weeks.
But all these big bits of news things kept sort of getting dropped.
Yeah.
And I felt like none of us were responding appropriately.
It's because everyone was watching CNN and nobody was watching BBC News.
It's so true. My favourite one that got dropped, which wasn't on our list of things to talk about, I'm just going to throw it in there anyway, is the government go backtracking on the Marcus Rashford
yes, of course,
school meal stuff, and suddenly there's going to be money and kids are going to get fed, and
they backtracked on quite a lot in the last couple of weeks. They backtracked on feeding children, which feels like a really
thanks for not being evil. Yeah. Well done.
They've backtracked on weekly testing for the NHS and care staff. There's been quite a few U-turns that we've seen, and maybe they're grateful that everyone else is watching CNN.
I do find like a backtrack quite an interesting one, a turnaround quite an interesting one, because it must be a difficult thing. So if you're going to change your mind, do you just sort of slip it out, hope no one notices? But then what's the point of changing your mind if no one notices? So surely then you're like, oh no, we should make a big deal of it. But how do you make a big deal with it without acknowledging that you were wrong in the first place?
I think it is a bit of a struggle because of the political world that we live in. That it's right or wrong almost. It's black or white. And then if you've said black and your opponents are saying white, then because it's going to be sold as a U-turn, as you backing down, backtracking, the opposition of one, it makes you put your heels a bit firmer in the ground and doesn't actually allow for, change. And I think we've seen a lot of the language that politicians kind of need to start with is talking about, not going to get things right. Or we've seen that a lot in a lot of COVID responses was, setting up that things might change quite rapidly because that's the nature of a new pandemic. But we do struggle, I think, with just, the Twitter noise, the approach that we take to politics, which doesn't seem like it allows for the Labour Party to work with the Tories or the Tories to work with the SNP.
It's so oppositional, isn't it? It's so us versus them. And the problem is that politicians get themselves there themselves, right? Because they've created that narrative. And yet the reality of sensible grown-up politics is that you know, all of these political parties represent an aspect of the nation, and that to get a good solution probably does require some compromise somewhere to move forward. But we've created a political system which really looks down upon compromise and sort of actively discourages it. Even, I would say, in the Scottish electoral system, which, you know, is probably set up to create compromise the most. You know, you shouldn't really be able to get a majority, although the SNP have achieved that very easily. And if you get a majority, you still basically can do what you can do in Westminster, which is anything you want. So there's very little reason for the SNP to compromise with Labour. And we saw that recently with them not voting for... so I think Labour put forward a motion about the tourism sector. And basically, because it wasn't a government bill, because it wasn't generated from there, the answer was no, and the SNP voted against it. And obviously Labour were like, the SNP want the tourism sector to die, which obviously the SNP don't. But, you know, and there we go. So
it's always that sort of, oh, if you vote against something, it means that you don't support it. But we know that, you know,
I personally I hate tourism, and they bring in their money and employing our people. It's awful. How dare they?
Sometimes it's a word that catches these motions out. And, you know, I know as someone that was an advisor in Westminster that took a bit of legislation through, that getting that compromise is really difficult. Because sometimes, you know, words or the civil service are often actually more the barrier to some of that compromise, because words mean things in the longer term. So words in a bill that might get passed, the impact of that was more challenging, not so much for the politicians who believed that what should happen, but actually sometimes it's the officials that are saying, no, we don't want this to happen because that could have ramifications in 5-10 years. But the SNP did vote with Labour, a Labour amendment to a motion about coronavirus and care homes, I'm sure, just in the last week. So
and do you know what I was just thinking? Like, is the care review and the looking at the National Care Service, is that actually a compromise? Because, you know, Labour in some ways were upset, like, well, the SNP's stolen our idea and this kind of chat. Well, maybe you shouldn't be upset about that. Maybe you should be thrilled. Maybe we should be like, this is great. We're so glad we've convinced you. Let's work together to make this awesome.
And on the care review, I mean, the former Labour MSP Malcolm Chisholm is on the care review. They couldn't be closer to being involved in that, I think, in any normal sense. But that was a good tangent to go off on.
Yeah, that's not even. It's not on the list, people. It's not on the orange list.
So, what's our first news thing that we're actually going to talk about, that we plan to talk about?
I think the first one we have to talk about is the one that's probably upsetting the nation the most, that has sent middle-aged mums across the country, you know, into absolute despair. And that is that Nicola Adams and Katia are out of Strictly Come Dancing, not because they didn't dance brilliantly, but because Katia's come down with coronavirus. And isn't it sad? I think, you know, Nicola Adams has been they've both been amazing champions for the first same-sex couple.
Yeah.
And they've just been, I think their dancing has been great, but I also think the representation that they've brought has been brilliant. And I think actually as well, it's so good that the first same-sex couple was actually 2 women and not 2 men, because I think that in itself smashes some stereotypes as well.
It made me watch Strictly for the first time in years. You know, it's been the kind of thing that if it was on in the background, I wouldn't have minded. But I actually made a point of watching it this time because I was I wanted to support them and support the show, because, you know, it's not been without its backlash. You know, Anne Widdecombe, the homophobe in chief.
We'll probably get a copyright strike for that now. Damn
it! You know, like, some people have been criticizing Strictly for it, but, you know, I think anybody just had to watch and see how absolutely fun it was for them both to be dancing. And it is a shame that coronavirus is now a homophobic virus, and is stopping this couple from dancing and participating. And it's a shame there's not any backup dancers for them to dance with, because it could have meant that she was still in the show. But I guess That's
I'm not sure
almost
if it could have, because I think because
because
she's having to
they were in
isolate.
contact. Yes, you're right.
Yeah, so I think actually that's probably why they're cut. I just hope that next year that they invite Nicola Adams and Katia back again and say
Yes,
have
of
another
course.
go. And actually they go, but you know what? We're not just going to have one same-sex couple.
We're going
We're
to
going to
have
have two.
5.
Oh, five, okay. This is an interesting insight into me and Nathan's politics, where I'm like, we'll have two, and Nathan's like 17.
No, I think it is a shame. It was a shame to see the news. I think they're obviously gutted,
Mm.
and but what can you do? You know, the show. I have to say, watching the show and also the sort of backstage bits that they've been showing about how they've done it through coronavirus, how they've made sure they could put on what is one of the nation's most loved entertainment shows. They've gone above and beyond to make sure that show looks and feels as normal as it would have done in previous years. Obviously, there's not a big audience, but they've still got people there clapping and cheering all the dancers. They've still got Craig Revel Hallwood being awful. And they still pop on Bruno Toglioni, even though he's not there.
You know, I met Craig Hallwood once, and he wasn't awful. He was very nice.
No, I've heard he's a really nice man, and he staged a version of Chess the Musical, which was one of my favourite versions that I've ever seen. Chess.
Nothing happens in Chess the Musical.
I mean, that's a lie, but it was written by two geniuses, and Craig staged it very well with musical actors and everything. And I saw it at the Edinburgh Playhouse, and I think there was maybe 500 of us there. The biggest theatre in Scotland, many a seat. But yeah, he plays a character like Simon Cowell plays a character, and people love the show for that as well. Although he did give Jackie Smith a 3, which I thought very unwarranted.
Jackie Smith, she has become like a bit, you know, I don't think that she really stood out when she was Home Secretary, but she's one of these people that post-political life has become a bit of a treasure. You know, people love her on her podcast radio show. People really enjoyed her in Strictly. Like, I think she's grand. And I don't think that she was all that keen on identity cards, which is also good. I think that was a David Blunkett passion. And a Blunkett passion. You know what, though, this does show us is that, and this is going to be a very smooth segue, so you'll be very impressed with this, Nathan. What this does show us is that despite us having news of a vaccine, the virus hasn't gone away. And, you know, the announcement of the vaccine just a couple of days after the presidential election results gives us all hope.
Was it a conspiracy against Donald Trump, though? That's what we need to know. Because Donald Trump said they held off on that news till after the election as part of the Democratic steal.
The Democratic steal. The thing that I would say to Donald Trump on that is, you didn't fund them. They weren't part of Operation Warp Speed. They can do what they bloody want, mate. And actually, if they did do that, if they did hold off, that was probably them being very sensible because they didn't want to affect the results of the election in any way. And that was probably the mature thing to do.
Although actually, I've been reading a couple of articles about Pfizer and their vaccine. One about the lovely couple that are, you know, two of the masterminds behind it that worked on their birthday and anniversary to make it happen. That were migrants from Turkey to Germany, and you know, proving that that freedom of movement and immigration are great things, but Pfizer's chief executive sold over £5 million worth of shares on the day that they announced the vaccine in what was described as a planned sale. But I wondered if, yes, it was okay for them to have had a planned sale, but did they just happen to postpone the announcement until the day of a planned sale so that you'd make lots of money?
Well, the thing is, right, that's how shares work. Like, you sell your shares when the stock price goes up. He didn't sell the shares with inside knowledge. He didn't do inside trading. It wasn't, I'm going to sell them now because I know our shares are going to plummet. He waited until the announcement was made, sold his shares when it was up. Like, I don't know. I'm not that bothered. What I am bothered about, though, is, it's rich people getting richer. All right, it's great. I'm sure that's added to his other like 55 million pounds. But what I am bothered about is that what a remarkable achievement this is for humanity. And people were using very grandiose language, but I think it's true. It is like going to the moon. In less than a year, we have managed to create a vaccine which is 90% effective.
Create a virus. That was the
hopefully. Well, there's some conspiracy theorists that think that is what happened in Wuhan in a secret lab, but let's not go there. But like, we've managed to create something, and like, anyone that doubts the power of science, or anyone that doubts the ability of the human race to achieve what it needs to and what it wants to achieve when it sets its mind to it, you're wrong. And I honestly think this is something that we will hopefully in future say, this stands up as one of the great achievements of mankind. Now the question is, how are we going to get the vaccine again? How are we going to get the virus to everyone? How are we going to get the vaccine distributed fairly?
Yeah.
What are we going to do about this? Is the challenge. And also, because the rich countries have been a bit sneaky
and already ordered it,
we've already bought it. Yeah. We've already bought ourselves back. We're not through the World Health Program, but through our own means. Now, that's great if you are the UK that's rich. And I know sometimes we forget that we are super rich, but we are super rich. But if you are Malawi, it's more of a significant issue. And also, if you're Malawi, the logistical challenges of distributing a vaccine at minus 70 degrees Celsius is like epic. So where you don't have reliable power sources, the temperature is already very high, your infrastructure is not necessarily as good. So, I think we're not there yet, because
it doesn't feel very equitable. They've said that with this particular virus, and there are vaccines, and there are many other vaccines in the pipeline that will probably come out with very similar news in a short while. They're all like you said, they need to be stored at certain temperatures. They need 2 or more doses of the vaccine. Which is a challenge for producing it. I think that Pfizer said they can make something like 50 million by the end of this year,
which itself is insane.
Yeah, which is a great feat of engineering, but that's not going to solve the world's ills. Then next year, I think they're estimating 1.2 billion vaccines in the whole of next year, which we know there's nearly 8 billion people in the world. I think there needs to be some mechanism to ensure that, one, you cannot pay for the vaccine yourself. Bill Gates should not be able to get the vaccine before it's available to other people. I believe anyway, and you might disagree, I think there needs to be that kind of level of this is a global pandemic. We need some sort of parity of esteem for people to get it. But it also then needs to go to the people that are most at risk of severe cases of COVID before it goes to other people.
So I agree with you, but there's 2 challenges to what you just said there. So I suppose the first challenge is that that's not how the world is set up, right? So the world is sadly not set up where all nations are equal and have equal resources, and the challenge is that we have a rationed resource, right? There's a resource that is being rationed, and what that means is the more wealth they have, more power to engage with that. The second challenge is that that Pfizer is a private company, so technically speaking, they can do whatever they want. Now, I actually tend to agree with you. I think that whilst you've got a rationed resource, which is vital for humanity, the state should take a lead and should decide, but which state? But like the system should take a lead and try to make it equitable. But how do you do it? Like I don't know the function of how you do it, because it's almost like Pfizer is a multinational. It is beyond one country to do that. And the United Nations, sadly, as we know, is a hollowed out institution where the strong governments of the world, probably since before the Iraq War, have just, ignored it. And I think that that this is a time where I think we will really miss those multinational, multilateral institutions.
Yeah.
And I think particularly poorer countries will miss them the most.
And hopefully we'll get some leadership from Joe Biden when he rejoins the WHO,
Yes.
and leads forward.
And the Paris Accords.
And well, of course, but I was referencing COVID more than.
Yes, sorry, I just got excited.
I think that's all we've got for coronavirus today. I think we've talked about that on every podcast, probably even including our US specials, in some way. So
I suppose the one other coronavirus thing just to touch on very briefly, for those people that are listening, I got a slight eye roll there from Nathan because I think he wants to move on. But it wasn't like a full eye roll; it was like a sort of 20% eye roll, so it's fine. Which was that Nicola Sturgeon, with the extension of furlough scheme, which we haven't really talked about either. So obviously, furlough scheme, which we're told was absolutely impossible to be extended. An epic U-turn, a U-turn costing hundreds of billions of pounds. Will now be extended into March, which is incredible. It's how it always should have been. And obviously, the consequences of these constant U-turns is that there's so many businesses, charities, and other organizations that have let people go, made decisions about like whether they should shut or not, people that they should employ, all based on this information. So when you constantly do these U-turns like this, it's actually really damaging and really undermines confidence. But it's the right decision because ultimately we need that. But there's two things of that. One, the Scottish government, and I think it was mostly the Scottish government, managed to get the UK government to agree that they could use it when they wanted, as in the Scottish government could use it when they wanted, which I think is a huge concession. But the second thing about it is that Nicola Sturgeon then could stick with her plans, because at one point it looked like that she was going to have to abandon the tier system, put us all into lockdown in order to be able to access the furlough, which I think people would have been very unhappy with, but I think also would have been the right decision, so we could get access to that. She didn't have to make that call in the end. In the end, what she decided to do is stick with the tiered system, and quite controversially, on I think it was Tuesday, she issued the updated tier list where a number of local areas that thought that they would potentially be going down a tier did not.
I think this is the challenge, I think that Nicola's been the First Minister.
First name terms, I know, I was like...
I think the First Minister's been in a really difficult position because she wants to give people some hope and some, opportunities, and for people to see some opportunities. And she did say when she outlined the tier system and what tiers we were all going in, that Edinburgh was one of the places where it might be possible early on to move from a 3 to a 2. That's not been possible at the first review. And I think people are like, oh, well, I'm really annoyed because you told me that we were going to go down. She didn't say that in some respects, but I do think that's the balancing act that she obviously has to play, is by trying to give people a bit of hope that things aren't going to be as restricted as we are for a long time. But then we need to get it right. She said in one of the briefings this week, just reducing the restrictions is not just then nothing is going to happen. Reducing the restrictions means infection rates will go up. So you have to do that at the point in which infection rates are as low as they can be, so that it's safe to do that, not just for, people that might become infected, but the hospital capacity, and other things like, travel between different areas. I think what was interesting...
Part of the criticism was that the decision of how those decisions being made, the date on how those decisions were being made, wasn't published until very, very late. And even when it was so it was about, like, there was a graph... But it's about, if you look at the original table, right, and it was like the numbers of people per 100,000, and it was like this range of people would be in this tier, this range of people in that tier. Edinburgh, for example, has been in tier 2 land now for weeks, and is continuing on a downward trajectory. Only
with reference to the number of infections, not necessarily the other considerations, which are, where are people traveling to? And these are, I think, some of the other considerations. They've just put Fife up to level 3 because of the proximity to Dundee. And it would have then been a bit strange to put Edinburgh down to 2 because of our proximity to Fife, but also the links between Glasgow and Edinburgh for people that work. So I think there's a lot more considerations that have to be made than just the infection number. And that's what she continually said, was this is about the movement of people. And, it's without forcing people to have, ID checks at the border of Edinburgh or Glasgow, it's about trying to take a holistic approach to that. And actually, it's probably more reasonable to try and get everywhere in the central belt down to a point where Edinburgh and other areas might start to be able to loosen up the restrictions.
Controversial question for you. Why is Glasgow not going down? The rest of the central belt is seeing a really steady decline. Glasgow has consistently not.
They love their house parties.
Wow. I didn't expect that one, Nathan, to be honest.
I really don't know. I don't know if it's...
Is it to do with poverty?
Well, there obviously is a lot of that sort of inherent inequality. One of the things that I think is quite interesting is, at the start of lockdown in March, we saw that Everyone In campaign that was about making sure that homeless people had somewhere to stay and be safe from coronavirus. I don't think we've seen that this time. I've heard that we've not seen it in London. I think that probably means we've not seen it in Scotland. There is an issue with homeless people in Glasgow, people who are using drugs and homeless, and continued ongoing outbreak of HIV there. I think there's probably an inherent inequality around homeless people and coronavirus. I also think it comes down to work and the type of work that people might be forced or feel forced to have to do in order that that they make enough money to pay the bills, and sometimes not even pay the bills.
Well, that's the difference. You and I have jobs where we can decide exactly where we want to do our jobs and if we want to go out or not go out, and generally haven't been out whatsoever. So I think, but if you have a job which is in the hospitality sector, if you have a job which isn't paying as well, in a call center,
I know a lot of the call centers
or factory
were bringing people back, and it was a case of you come back into work or you can leave. And that's, call centers are a lot of people using a building, but not just using that building, but they're then using transport links, and they're walking about in the street, and they're going for lunch. It's all of those things that increase the likelihood of you being in contact with someone. And there's also, that it is the digital divide, because we've got this app that people can have on their phones.
Everyone should have on their phones if they can.
They should absolutely have it on their phones.
Protect Scotland.
And never delete it or switch it off when you're in school.
And if you get a new phone, you have to turn it back on again. I learned this.
Oh, really?
Yes, I did.
But I do think that it's, it is no access to smartphones another issue. Do we have a responsibility when we're giving someone? When we're giving the public an app, do we have a responsibility then to make sure that everyone in the country can have access to the technology that means they can also benefit from that app? Because that's a debate that needs to be had. If this is a public health tool, then do we need to make sure that everyone has a smartphone?
So let us take ourselves down to the big smoke down south at the bottom of this fair isle, which is London, where there's been a bit of drama going on in the heart of government, behind those famous doors of Number 10 Downing Street. Do you want to give us a rundown of the drama, Nathan?
Yeah, well, I've not actually seen much of this drama,
Oh.
other than I was aware the Prime Minister was looking to appoint a Chief of Staff, and that was.
Did you apply?
That was news, because there hasn't been a Chief of Staff for Boris Johnson since he took over as Prime Minister. Dominic Cummings has been his Chief Advisor, but he's not had a Chief of Staff in a role. And so I thought that was quite a surprise. Then the person that was being pitched was obviously the Number 10 Director of Communications, Lee Kane. And then all of a sudden, he's handing in his resignation. And in between that, Boris Johnson's girlfriend, Carrie Symonds, seems to
Beyonce.
have been fiance, mother of his child, seems to have been involved in bringing him down in some way. And I have no idea how or why.
Well, I think one of the first things that people seem to forget is that Carrie Symonds is a political operator herself. So she's not just the wife or the future wife of the Prime Minister. You know, she was, I think, head of communications for the Conservative Party. She obviously has strong opinions. And it sounds very much like her and a number of other people have very much went against the Vote Leave camp. And Lee Kane was very much alongside, other people, was very much part of that Vote Leave camp. And the things that I'm sort of hearing from folk is that basically what happened was we had this showdown between two factions, one which is comes from the Vote Leave campaign. Those are people that worked on that and then moved into Downing Street, led by Dominic Cummings, versus a sort of smaller faction within Downing Street, but supported significantly more by MPs outside of Downing Street, who haven't thought that things have went smoothly and been run well within government, think that the skills of governing and campaigning are very different, and feel that the difference between, and this is something that I think I heard on the BBC and I thought was very smart, and that basically are the difference between people who are about the project rather than people who are about the Prime Minister, and that clash had been going on actually for some time. And this was Carrie Symonds really asserting her authority and saying that Lee Kane should not be getting promoted. Now, the real drama kicked off because Dominic Cummings, who the Prime Minister has now went out to bat for a number of times and taken substantial political hits, was on the verge of resignation. And I suppose what we don't know now is he hasn't resigned as of yet, but what we don't know now is, well, what is the fallout from this? Is the departure of Lee Kane the ascendancy of the pro-Boris, traditional conservatism faction, or is it that this is the start of a rumbling battle that will continue on through inside of government? And is this the kind of stuff that really we need to be happening in the middle of a global pandemic?
Well, is it the kind of stuff that people care about happening in the middle of a global pandemic? Because, this is all being played out in the media, and journalists are frothing at the mouth to be the first one to get a source. And I always think, do people care? There is some, I think you've done it better than I've seen on social media anyway, at pointing out what some of the ramifications might be or what the impact might be on things like, governing. But it seems to be driven by personality and, who Laura Kuenssberg can speak to first to get that bit of gossip. And I think that people don't really care.
So I think I agree. So I kind of agree and don't agree. So I agree that that actually a lot of this is driven by personality, and a lot of it is about Dominic Cummings, actually, not about Lee Kane. And it's about him being such a high-profile public figure.
I'd never actually heard of Lee Kane until yesterday.
I barely registered who he was. Yeah. And the thing that stands out to me is I always remember the thing that Alistair Darling said, which is that when you are the advisor and you are consistently becoming the story, you need to go. And he says that's why he resigned from the Blair government, because the story was consistently becoming about him, not his ability to manage the situation. Yeah. And I think there's something very telling about that, and I think that's something that the Prime Minister should do. Whether people care or not, I'd almost go and say it doesn't matter whether they care or not. What matters is that this does matter. So it matters who is driving government forward. And we know, let's be honest, we know that people love Boris Johnson because they see him as someone that they can impart their own values onto, their own agendas onto, and who is persuadable. He is someone who will take up a mantle and go with it even if he didn't come up with it himself. So the people that he is listening to and engaging with matter a lot. And I think that's why it's really important to get to the source of it. I think we all get excited by the drama and sort of the melodrama of it. But the real question is that will the government become more competent out of this or not? And I don't think we know the answer to that, but the fact that they're having such, I think that the Prime Minister was meeting with Dominic Cummings at, I think, 9 p.m. last night, like going into the evening, arguing. Sources were coming out saying that he was furious, that voices were raised. Like, it's
Raised
drama.
voices.
I know,
Who'd
right?
have thought?
Like, we would never raise a voice.
Staying with Westminster for a bit, Tracy Crouch had quite a good statement today, because she's been at home recovering and being treated for breast cancer, and there was a debate in the Commons about breast cancer.
Great, she'll have lots of lived experience to talk to everyone about.
You would think that would be a great opportunity to utilise the hybrid parliament that we have been so used to, and apparently not. That ability has been removed from MPs. They were not able to join, apparently.
On what grounds?
And Jacob Rees-Mogg not being a fan of the virtual parliament.
That man is the worst. It's like some sort of Victorian.
And Tracy, Tracy, who is a former sports minister for the Conservatives, has rightly said that she was disappointed that she wasn't able to partake in a debate. Probably, as often MPs who have been suffering from serious health issues come and praise their health team because the NHS doesn't get enough praise. But she's been accused of shirking her duties because she can't.
Who's accused her of that? Because I'll punch him in the face.
Well, she said it didn't mean that they were shirking her duties. So I imagine that she's been told that, probably tweeted at her, because that's where a lot of this hate comes from.
It's outrageous.
But why? Everyone else is able to work from home. Why can't MPs? Well, we kind of know why. It's because Boris Johnson doesn't like an empty House of Commons. He likes the rabble rousing. He was very nervous going up against Keir Starmer when there was less than 10 people behind him. But Jacob Rees-Mogg has said there needed to be a balance between the needs of MPs and the needs of the House as a whole.
Do you know what? You're 100% so that is ridiculous. The MPs are the House as a whole. But the thing that you said there, I thought was really interesting, was you're 100% right, because when the House was basically empty and it was just Boris versus Keir, like, it actually became a discussion. It became a discussion about detail and detail policy that Boris couldn't have. He couldn't engage in that level of discussion. He needs the broing chorus behind him. But I honestly think, though, that kind of position from Jacob Rees-Mogg is both, it is awful and it's ridiculous. It's actually dangerous, though, as well. It sends the wrong message to the general public. It encourages people to feel bad for being off work because they're sick. It doesn't support flexible working. Like, it is, whether you support the Conservative Party or not, how can you support someone who puts his idiosyncratic views ahead of the health and safety of the people that he's meant to be working with?
We're no longer living in 1970. It's 2020.
Yeah. Or 1870.
Soon to be 2021.
Future man.
And it feels like there should be some form of give. I mean, a hybrid parliament is exactly what you want, surely.
Totally. And it's worked. It's not even just like, oh, this is a fanciful idea that someone's had. Oh, maybe we'll have to try it one day. No, we've had it, and it's worked really successfully. I think it's just ridiculous. But before we finish, Nathan, can we stay in Westminster? So it's a very Westminster-focused episode, this one. Because I think we should talk very briefly about the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack's comments. You're rolling your eyes at him now. That's better than rolling your eyes at me. So Alistair Jack is the Secretary of State of Scotland. People might not know that. And he, in an I don't know who the interview was with, actually. In an interview, said that a generation was 40 years. So once in a generation means that in 40 years' time, there can be a second independent referendum and not before. So since then, he has backtracked significantly and said that he was joking. Well, he wasn't laughing when he said it.
Jocular, he said.
Jocular. That sounds quite posh.
Which I wasn't sure if if he meant joking or if it was one of those sort of down the pub with the jocks type, very strange, very strange.
Very odd. But what's interesting about this has kicked a lot of flurry into action, because we then had John Major, former Prime Minister, giving a very in-depth, if slightly odd speech, I would say, personally. I'm not sure. Actually, I'd be interested to know your thoughts. So John Major basically said that you can't put this back into the bottle. He's a Democrat like me. If the people of Scotland vote for the majority of pro-independence parties, then you have to deal with this. You can't pretend it doesn't exist. But the way that you should deal with it should be through learning through the Brexit one. And there should be 2 independence referendums. The first one should be on principle to have one. And then the second one should basically be a confirmatory referendum based on the negotiating deal that was agreed between the Scottish governments and the UK government. What do you think of that, Nathan?
I think this is a bit of the challenge with some people backing a confirmatory referendum for the EU,
right?
And Brexit. That then this leads into this. This is really the conversation about never-endums, not wanting to have a referendum when public opinion's changed. Actually, it's like, oh, how many referendums do we need to settle on a decision? I think the problem with, I think, from a English perspective or a Conservative perspective, John Major's point is probably quite valid. The ability to have a referendum on the outcome of negotiations is really helpful to the party that feels like it might be losing something. Because it could rightly, or well, not rightly, but it could argue that the deal was terrible. And that would be the argument for a no vote, was that actually this negotiation is terrible for Scotland and it's better to be part of the UK, regardless of whether that vote or negotiation is terrible.
But the problem with that, though, is if you're Scotland, you can't really enter into that agreement because it presumes like everyone is going to be, being really good and really nice and like, we're totally being fair. Where actually it's an incentive for the other party in the negotiation
to not give you a lot.
To not even be reasonable.
Yeah.
Like it's an incentive to be as unreasonable and difficult as you possibly can, which isn't a good ground for a negotiation or a referendum of equal partners.
No.
So I think in theory it sounds like it's sensible, but it's actually why both a confirmatory referendum of both the EU deal and of a Scottish independence deal in reality doesn't work, because it only works as everyone is being like a good partner, and that's not how the real world works.
Yeah, I think you're right, and there's a number of challenges. Obviously, the SNP are calling for another referendum six years on, because there has been a significant change in the actual law of the country, and public opinion. Those things could happen 6 years after an independence vote, and that is democracy. But having, I think it puts the negotiating partners in a really bad position to then be having a vote on a negotiation. If it's that we need a negotiation to happen then you bring in international mediators. You bring in the President of the United States to mediate a negotiation on Scottish independence. Rather than having a confirmatory vote on whatever the negotiation is. I think that the fact that we're starting to see people like John Major even talk about there being another referendum is a move forward. It's certainly a move more forward than Alistair Jack saying, well, there's going to be 40 years.
They're freaking out. I think that's the thing. That there is,
but they're freaking out because refusing to allow a referendum, and this is Nicola Sturgeon's strategy, and there are a small number of people that don't support this strategy in the SNP, but ultimately this is the strategy that will win, because when public opinion shifts so dramatically, as it will, if the Conservatives refuse to grant a referendum. Now, ultimately, I don't think a formal request for a referendum has even gone in yet. I think this has all been hypothetical, all been hypothetical conversations, and the Conservatives said, no, there won't be one for another generation. When it comes to the point that the Scottish government send a formal request to hold a referendum, saying no to that is, is career ending when it comes to politics. Douglas Ross would lose his career. The Conservatives in Scotland would lose.
I'd only under certain, so I'm not sure if I agree with you, because only under certain circumstances, only under the circumstances where two things were valid. One, that the majority in the Scottish Parliament was pro-independence.
Which is already.
And two, impartial Nathan, and two, that the majority of people within Scotland wanted a referendum. So there's sort of a double lock there.
Which are currently the two parts, which
which is why my opinion is that if people want to have a referendum, then they should have to have a referendum. I think that now we're this far along, you need to wait for the election.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the key point here, is that it's almost a triple lock, actually. It's that there has been another vote, and then those two things, as you've mentioned, come true. And I think that's Nicola Sturgeon's point of view. That's what she wants to happen. I would say many, but it's not many. It's a Twitter noise of some voters that think, well, they've got a mandate already and they should just go for it.
4 people in a sheep.
That's not how politics works. And when the electorate and public opinion is what you need to win over, then doing it by the skin of your teeth isn't good enough. And we've seen that with Brexit. Actually, only winning by 4 points doesn't make a great country and a great decision. We would want, I think, Scotland would want an independent result of over 60% for it to be a resounding, yes vote, having come from a resounding vote for independent supporting parties in a Scottish Parliament election where a referendum's being promised.
What if that's the deal? What if the deal is you can have a referendum, but this is a big decision. It can't be by the skin of the teeth. It's, we'll have ramifications for hundreds of years. You has to win it by at least 60% of the vote.
Yeah, I think if something like Brexit and that had done, and there was precedent, there is precedent in that, because the Conservatives changed the rules around referendums when the Scottish devolution referendum happened in 1979. I think if that had continued to be, a reasonable consideration, and the Brexit vote had that same restriction, then I would agree with you and say, yes, okay, let's do that. I think that it's not so much that it needs to be, for the purposes of democracy. I think the SNP and the Scottish Government would want a resounding result so that they feel like they've taken public opinion with them during a campaign. It's important.
But would you take the deal? If the deal was you can have it with 60% of the vote, if you don't agree to that, then you can't have it.
Well, I think one of the points to consider is when the SNP negotiated a referendum in 2012, the Edinburgh Agreement, they were independence was at around 25 to 30% of the vote, and they managed to step that up with a campaign up to 45%. If at the moment the independence argument is around 50 to 58%, think about adding another 15% onto that.
So you would take it?
A risky person would consider it. I'm not sure if I agree it's democratic, but
I think it's democratic.
I definitely think it's possible.
Yeah, I think it's. I think it's a. If I was down south and I was Boris Johnson, I think it's what I would be considering. And I think what I would also be considering is like federalism and other things as well. But we're going to have to wrap up, but just a couple of other things that they've been talking about, just to sort of float the boat, as we would say, is they've been talking about whether they should have a snap referendum. So if the Scottish Government were to get in the majority, have it within 6 months.
That's what's going to happen. It's not going to be a 2-year.
No, please not.
It's not going to be a 2-year referendum.
Unless we bothered with that, right?
Absolutely going to be a 6-month lead-in time. They're not going to do that. You know, the Yes campaign peaked too soon last time. If it had peaked a week later, then Yes probably would have won. I think that, you know, there will be a real desire for this to be a short, sharp referendum campaign. But that means on all sides, campaigns need to be ready, need to have an argument. And I would say, you know, from someone from the Yes side in the past, that message goes out to the No side as well. Like, if we want to have well, they don't want to have a referendum, but if you can take that a referendum is inevitable, then there needs to be a plan for winning over people on either side. That's not just about, you know, the Project Fear, as Joe Pike's book was titled.
Joe's book was titled Project Fear. We should
book
get
it
Joe
was
on
too.
here. We both know Joe.
We should get Joe Pike on.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Okay, shall we wrap it up?
Before we wrap up, can I just say, because I'm not superstitious, but there is 40 minutes to go before Scotland play Serbia in their Euro playoff qualifying game, which could see Scotland get to their first tournament since 1998.
Great.
So, come on, the Tartan Army.
Yeah.
Why do you hate Scotland, Nick?
I don't. I love Scotland. I'm just not into football. But like,
I'm not that into football either. But come on, when the country's about to, you know, get into the Euro 2020, which will be played in 2021.
No, good luck to the Scotland team. I hope they win. But then also good luck to Serbia, because I'm sure they're lovely people too.
Okay.
That's not how this works. Okay.
Thank you very much for listening to a new nation discussing the ideas that matter. If you've got any suggestions for topics that you want to cover, or any guests that you would like to hear or see on our podcast, please do get in touch. We are on Twitter, a New Nation Pod, or you can follow me, Nathan Sparkling, on Twitter, or Nick M. Ward on Twitter as well. We're on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and email us too.
It's like half the podcast is just listing the social medias.
Give us a follow, give us a like, subscribe, and we hope you've enjoyed the podcast. Cheerio.
Chat to you next week. Bye, everyone.